Transitioning our economy to net zero is technically not as costly as you might think. The cost argument comes up all the time when I'm talking to friends and family about how the heck we're supposed to solve the climate crisis. But the reality is, this argument was largely created and spread by fossil fuel companies who are just scared of losing the trillions of profit they make each year. Yeah, so the cost argument against climate action is basically just propaganda created by fossil fuel companies who are scared that climate action will prevent them from getting the trillions of profit they make. Cost propaganda spreads ideas that decarbonizing our economy will increase taxes for Americans, will increase household energy costs, will create lots of job loss, and overall we won't be reaping the same benefits from an insanely profitable resource. I'm going to explain everything I learned from Genevieve Guenther's book, The Language of Climate Politics, about this cost argument. Genevieve Guenther is a PhD graduate from Columbia University and has dedicated her life to proper communication about climate action. So obviously switching to a decarbonized economy is going to involve a lot of work. It's going to take some time, and like any profitable investment, it's going to take a lot of money up front. Economists play a key role in trying to figure out at what pace we should be making this transition, so as to minimize the disturbance to our lifestyles, our pockets, the system in general, while we optimize our avoidance of some of the more dangerous outcomes of climate change. Currently, the pace that the US economy is following is just too slow. It's based upon economic calculations that completely fail to consider the costs of climate damages, and instead bank on the undisturbed growth of an economy deeply intertwined with fossil fuels. William Nordhaus of Yale University is considered by many to be the founder of climate economics. He is responsible for creating the Dynamic Integrated Climate Economy, or DICE, which is implemented in government calculations for environmental policies, the most famous of which would be carbon taxing. Nordhaus's model is based upon the idea that we should delay decarbonization for as long as we possibly can to fully reap the economic benefits of fossil fuels. For Nordhaus, this means that we would reach a maximum of 3 degrees at 2100 and then come down from there with all the profits we could possibly imagine to create whatever society we wanted. Sounds great, right? Well, unfortunately, the IPCC has declared that if we continue at our current rate of emissions till the end of the century, there will be a 10% chance of human extinction. This raises an important question. How the heck do you go about calculating the economic costs of our mass dying? To me, they seem kind of infinite. So here's where I have to do the obligatory explanation of what actually happens if we reach 3 degrees. Skip forward a little bit if you already know and don't really want your day ruined. So essentially at 3 degrees, even if there wasn't mass dying, there would still be some pretty major consequences. Everything from flooding, wildfires, droughts, heat waves, just intense storms in general, that will do costly damage to buildings and infrastructure, that will reduce labor productivity. They'll also put a lot of stress on our food systems, a lot of stress on our healthcare systems. And of course, all of these effects would give rise to social responses, mass migration, or the extreme scenario of climate wars, which is crazy to think about. Here's a specific example that Guenther gives that I think is just great. For up to 10 days per year, the entire east coast of the United States would be so hot that going outside would put you at risk of death. Yikes. So yeah, it's no wonder that economic models that aim for 3 degrees are criticized by economists and climate activists all over the world. It just makes economic and environmental sense to limit global heating to 2 degrees, which is why it's upheld by the Potsdam Institute for Climate Impact Research, by the Federal Ministry for Economic Affairs and Energy, and of course by the Paris Agreement. Stanford and UC Berkeley economists estimate that with 2.5 to 3 degrees of warming, there will be 15 to 25% reductions in per capita output in the US until 2100, as compared to 0 degrees of warming. So yeah, overall there's some pretty intense lowballing happening when estimating the economic costs of climate change. And these are still very prominent in the US economics. Next, I want to give you guys a bit of a glimpse into the everyday costs of decarbonized economy for your average American. A big part of the cost argument is that It's going to create increased energy costs, and it's going to reduce the availability of jobs, but these are mostly myths, so let's do some debunking. So first of all, the cost of renewable energy for consumers has only been decreasing every year. Lithium-ion batteries a decade ago were 90% more expensive. A decade ago, onshore wind power was 40% more expensive. And I mean, now solar energy is the cheapest form of energy in history. Solar and wind energy actually save Americans 40% compared to new gas plants and 66% compared to new coal plants. All of this, and yet still somehow 42% of Americans falsely believe that renewable energy will increase their household cooling and heating prices. This makes me wonder, what kind of propaganda were they fed? Now, what about all the jobs? A Goldman School and UC Berkeley study actually found that climate action will generate more than 500,000 jobs, which is coincidentally about the same amount of jobs currently held in America by fossil fuel workers. You might presently find your inner skeptic saying things like, what about the culture? There's no way all those fossil fuel workers would accept a job in such a different field. But thankfully, the United Mine Workers of America, which is America's largest coal union, recently announced that it would accept a transition away from fossil fuels if it could guarantee that their workers got secure jobs in renewable energy. This would in fact be a very important part of transitioning our economy to net zero emissions. We have to make sure all of those fossil fuel workers remain job secure. Thankfully, there will be hundreds of thousands of jobs available in conservation, adaptation, solar and wind energy, caregiving, construction, and more, many of which can be attained with a simple high school diploma. Another part of life that would be cheaper in a decarbonized economy would be healthcare. It's as simple as this. A healthier environment means healthier people, which will overall reduce people's healthcare costs. Here's a staggering fact from the IPCC. Keeping our planet below 2 degrees in the next 50 years will prevent Americans roughly 4.5 million premature deaths, roughly 3.5 million hospitalizations, and a cumulative 300 million lost workdays. That's crazy. Next, I want to talk a bit about national scale investments for decarbonization and ways that the government can support this transition. A study by the Lawrence Berkeley National Laboratory estimates that decarbonizing the economy will take roughly 0.2 to 1.2% of the US's GDP. On the other hand, a Princeton study shows that it'll take roughly 4 to 6% of the US's GDP. The IPCC estimates that 10% of 2020's global COVID-19 stimulus directed towards climate action for 5 years straight each year would effectively keep us below 2 degrees. Also, the fossil fuel industry is not nearly as strong as it used to be. It's not the same kind of cornerstone to the US economy as it once was. But still, there's so much demand for and support for its production. By 2030, fossil fuel suppliers have planned to produce 45% more than what is consistent with 2-degree targets. We can see just how inconvenient staying below 2 degrees will be for fossil fuel companies when we consider that to meet these goals, 1/3 of all oil reserves, about half of methane gas reserves, and over 80% of coal reserves will have to stay in the ground. These unburned resources are currently valued at $3.3 trillion, $350 billion of which is owned in equity throughout the United States. Thankfully though, only about 1/3 of that is actually owned by the bottom 90%. So Guenther proposes a few things that the US government should be doing to support decarbonization. I know that the government support right now is eons away from even thinking about climate change, but in the future, when we do resume our right path, it's important stuff to know. The first thing she recommends is that the government's funds should be directed towards renewable energies and towards sustainable infrastructure. She also suggests that there needs to be an incremental ban put in place on private fossil fuel production. She says that subsidies towards fossil fuels need to be incrementally reduced and that fossil fuel workers need to have job security elsewhere, like I already mentioned. Ultimately, Guenther does admit that there is no solid answers for where the funding for decarbonization might come from. What she does say, though, is that a lot of it might be, in fact, from the private sector, and that we will require the government's support to create the conditions for a decarbonized economy to root, develop, and flourish. All in all, Guenther states that a war on climate change could bring about another economic golden era for the US, making Americans healthy and prosperous. This is very at odds with the propaganda that's been spread by fossil fuel industries about the harmful costs of climate action. We must remember that they're just not true. The last point that Guenther stresses is that there is no way to have a sustainable economy if we do not take into consideration the environment that it is built upon.